Hey everybody, I am Stephanie Rieger and I'm with the Bookstock team, and I just want to welcome you all to this event. It should be very interesting and topical, and we're great to see you all out on this rainy day. Before we begin, I want to thank Liza Bernard and the library staff for partnering with Bookstock and putting this together, and so I just want to give you a thank you. So today we have Peter Canellos, who is an award-winning author and writer. He's a Boston native. He is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia Law School. He was at the Boston Globe as editor of the editorial page, and in that capacity, he was on teams winning 2 Pulitzer Prize and finalist for 5 others. He is now the managing editor for Enterprise at Politico. At the Boston Globe, he was the editor of The Fall and Rise of Ted Kennedy, which was on the New York Times bestseller list and a top 10 in 2009. So this should be great. And as you all know, the reason you're here is he is the author of The Great Dissenter about Supreme Court Justice Harlan, and you will learn a lot more about that today. And he's currently working on a biography of Samuel Alito. Peter's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then he is going to be joined by Adam Willis, who was a researcher and collaborator of Peter's on The Great Dissenter. He is a writer at the Boston Banner, and he just in climate and environment, and he just worked on a series that won the Pulitzer himself. So we have 2 great people in conversation together. And so after that, they're going to be in conversation together. And my one fun fact is, although he contributed on The Great Dissenter, this is the first time they will be in conversation together in an event like this. So we're in for a special treat. Can everyone please welcome Peter Canellos and then Adam.
And to actually bring people together and to celebrate books and to talk about words and talk about ideas is so important. And I know the tremendous hard work that the organizers did to make this event a reality. And I certainly take my hat off for them, and I feel very honored to be part of this. It's also obviously a special event, as Stephanie alluded to, because Adam worked with me for 3 years on this book, and this is indeed the first time that he's been at any of these Harlan talks. So it is a very special thing to be here with Adam. Also, Priscilla Painton, who edited The Great Dissenter, is here, and Hannah Park, who worked on it as well, and my good friend from Vermont, Lisa Kissel. So it's a very nice event for me. I know most of you are here because you want to hear about the Supreme Court, and you're probably thinking a lot about the Supreme Court, which has suddenly become a very urgent issue here in Vermont. And it's very much on people's minds, and anyone I know who's concerned about the state of the country today is looking to the court and wondering what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Harlan first before we discuss the current day court, because I think it's really important context. It's really the most important story. The sort of arc of Harlan's career covers the most important period in Supreme Court history. And it also illustrates the centrality of the Supreme Court in our daily lives, both in the past, but also today in the present. People often ask me, why are you interested in John Marshall Harlan, someone who served on the Supreme Court from 1877 until 1911? And what I say is that we now have the benefit of hindsight, which is something we all would like, right? We'd like to be able to project ourselves 100 years into the future and be able to see who was right and how everything played out and everything. But we know that about Harlan's time on the court. And some of the things kind of really leap out at you. And 2 of them have had very dramatic effects on our lives and continue to have effects on our lives today. The first is the tremendous income inequality that existed between 1877 and 1911. It was the Gilded Age, and it was the time when the sense of America as having these sort of tremendous vicissitudes from incredible wealth, people building mansions that we still are touring right nearby here, and people who were living, even people working really hard in factories who were living, 5 to a room in tenements. So you had income inequality that took hold. You also had the start of segregation, the effects of which obviously linger today in a very profound way. It was when the hard-fought gains of the Civil War were rejected and gave way to a period of separation in society. So the question is, how did that happen during that period? Who was responsible for this? And the answer is very surprising. It was not any one president. There were like 8 presidents during that period. None of them ran on a platform of segregation or ran on a platform of income inequality. It was not principally the presidential politics that did it, right? In Congress, just like today, Congress had a lot of problems passing bills, and there were year-long delays, and there was a lot of Sturm and Drang surrounding Congress. But at crucial moments, Congress stood up, right? So if you're thinking about income inequality, Congress stood up in the early 1890s and passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was designed to break up these business trusts where a single manufacturer would collude with a railroad to be the sole provider of goods, and they would set wages and prices accordingly. The Sherman Antitrust Act gave the Justice Department the power to crack down on trust violations, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. The Congress also stepped up and passed an income tax. At the time, the federal government was funded solely through tariffs. Tariffs were very, very regressive because the same 1-cent tariff on coffee that was imported was paid by, the exact same cent was paid by the immigrant workers living 5 to a tenement and by John D. Rockefeller, same 1 cent. An income tax is a much fairer way to fund the government, certainly believed so at the time. And Congress finally got up the will to pass it, but the Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. State legislatures stepped in. They said, these companies that are forcing people to work 80-hour weeks and maintaining very unhealthy conditions in the process, due to the imbalance between labor and management, we're going to mandate a 60-hour per week minimum on labor laws. But the Supreme Court declared them per se unconstitutional. Any law that was designed to improve labor relations was declared to be unconstitutional. On the racial side, Congress stepped up. 1875, they passed the Civil Rights Act that guaranteed black people and all people equal access to the rudiments of society, transportation, the banking system, restaurants, and inns. But in 1883, the Supreme Court declared it to be unconstitutional. 15th Amendment gave black people right to vote. Very important right. The state of Alabama passed a constitution that grandfathered in all Confederate veterans as voters, and then said other people could be accepted or rejected by poll takers depending on their judgment of their character, which effectively disenfranchised all black people in Alabama and a lot of white people as well. So, Washington got 5,000 black men who had voted before, paid all the poll taxes, passed all the literacy tests. They were regular voters, were now being denied. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, Alabama's system is clearly unconstitutional, but we don't have an enforcement mechanism, so this is a political question, and we have to punt. And then, when states in the South, particularly, started mandating segregation, like they did in Louisiana, black people have to be in a separate railroad coach, the Supreme Court accepted that argument, and in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, they gave the legal imprimatur of the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, to segregation. So, what do we see in all of those cases that I mentioned? The Sherman Antitrust Act, the income tax, Lochner v. New York, which was about health and safety and labor laws, Civil Rights Act, the voting rights, the Plessy v. Ferguson and segregation. The common thread in all of those cases, John Marshall Harlan dissented, and in the majority of them, he was the sole dissenter. So now, today, almost everybody in the legal system believes that all of those cases were wrong. people today, left, right, center, bring a team of professors in. They'd all say, oh, those were all unfortunate, grievous mistakes. The Supreme Court, fell prey to the terrible temper of the times. So the question is, we now say Harlan was right in all those cases, the most important cases of that era, and the majority, in fact, everybody else, in most cases, was wrong. So the book is an exploration of how Harlan got it right, and it's a lesson to us of like, well, what does wisdom in judging actually entail? How do people develop a kind of moral compass to be able to see beyond the sort of clouds of the moment and look into the future and chart a better course? That was the starting point for the book. Now, I'll jump ahead and say the answers to that were multifold. So one answer was in the conditions of Harlan's upbringing and in his life. He was born in 1833 in Danville, Kentucky. And he was born to a super patriotic family. His father was the leading lawyer in Kentucky. The leading families of Kentucky, who were just one generation removed from the frontier, really believed that they were creating a new kind of nirvana there in the bluegrass, that they were perfecting the American system. They were very aspirational. His father also believed strongly in the rule of law. He was named John Marshall for the great Chief Justice John Marshall, who was the man who instituted judicial review and who said that the law supersedes politics. Now, there was a special reason for that, too, because in that part of Kentucky, they were desperately fearing the coming Civil War. So if you imagine John Marshall Harlan growing up as a very promising boy in that small town, hearing about the greatness of the Declaration of Independence, the greatness of the Constitution, but knowing that it could all fall apart at any moment because of this sectional crisis that was looming, this political crisis that was about to overwhelm him. So that was a hugely formative decision, especially when in 1858, when Harlan was 25 years old, the Supreme Court came down with the Dred Scott decision, which we all now count as another one of those very big mistakes on the part of the Supreme Court, where they went way beyond the facts at hand. Dred Scott was a formerly enslaved person living as a freed man in the North, and the question was whether to return him to slavery. And the court went beyond the facts of the case to say that in the Constitution, black people have no rights that white people have to respect, even free black people. And he said it even though in 6 states in the country, there were free black people at the time of the ratification of the Constitution. And I think Harlan knew at age 25, and when the Dred Scott decision came down, he was already heavily involved in politics as a moderate trying to defend the Union in Kentucky. He realized that compromise would not hold and that this war was going to be calm. So that's one major factor, I think, in his life. It's also worth noting, if you're looking at him as a potentially heroic figure and things like that, that he put union above all else, and he and his father and Henry Clay, who was their great inspiration in Kentucky, Henry Clay known as the Great Compromiser, for noble reasons, I think. They tried to compromise and find some way to put slavery on a path to extinction or to colonization, another bad idea, but they were busy supporting that as a potential compromise, or compensating slave owners or buy back enslaved people. But they were moderates in that era, trying to preserve the Union, and would say, look, if they believed in Kentucky, their state would be destroyed if the war came, and that they would be the battlefield, and also they knew that their own civic fabric was half sentimental slaves, half sentiment free. They would be destroyed. So the Harlans were trying very hard to effect compromises during that period. But I think that when Dred Scott came down and when the war came, and Harlan himself fought and put together a regiment of 800 people to defend the Union, I think he learned that compromise doesn't always work. And it's important to get it right the first time. Very important to get it right. Now, another major formative experience for John Marshall Harlan was a man who grew up alongside him in his home, and his name was Robert Harlan. And Robert Harlan was a man of mixed race who was born enslaved. He was born in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, which is way to the south of Virginia, which is where John Harlan's grandmother's family came from. His father's mother's family was from Mecklenburg County. And we know, because Robert Harlan became a well-known person later in life, that he and his mother made a journey when he was 8 years old to Kentucky to find his father. That's in contemporaneous news reports from the time when Robert Harlan was a well-known person. This was his personal story. And where did they go? They went to Harlan Station, which was a family town right outside Danville that was all basically the Harlan family. So obviously, the mother, herself a person of mixed race, believed that Robert's father was a Harlan man. And we know that Robert ended up living with James Harlan, John's father, when he was 8 years old and when James had just married John's mother. And this was before John was born, but John was born a few years later. So when John was growing up, Robert Harlan was living alongside the family in this unusual sort of status where he had this close relationship with John's father. And again, we know from those same profiles that Robert thought very, very highly of James Harlan, considered him a mentor, considered him essentially a father figure. John also, I'm sure, would have heard the local gossip, which was relentless, that Robert was James's son from this relationship in Mecklenburg County. But Robert Harlan led an extraordinary life. Robert Harlan, the long joke in his life was that he had half a day's schooling because James Harlan tried to get him enrolled in public school, but he was kicked out because he was a black person. Paradoxically, that empowered him to live a slightly more adventurous life than the other Harlan boys in the family, who were sort of committed to this sort of cloistered study system. So Robert developed this quality that I think held him in good stead for his whole life, which was to look for opportunities and to find ways to succeed against even the greatest odds that were out there. And certainly being enslaved has to be the greatest odds against you. He found an opportunity in the horse racing industry, which at the time was just getting started in Kentucky, and people used to talk about checkerboards, white and black people at all these races. And he quickly developed a reputation for sizing up racehorses and being an excellent trainer. And so he would barnstorm the state to set up races. And you had to be a tough guy to do that because you had to maintain the betting system. You had to have a pouch with all the winnings in it and things like that. So if you imagine John Harlan as a little boy seeing Robert, who's known for his good looks and his strength of character and his charisma, coming back on a horse with a pouch full of money from these races, I think you have a sense that John probably admired Robert. The next experience for Robert Harlan, the gold rush in 1848. He hears about gold being found in California and says, here's a place where the old divisions aren't going to be enforced in the usual way. So he was among the first group of Kentuckians to go all the way down Mississippi, cross to Panama from New Orleans, cross the country of Panama, which is a rainforest, mountains, and all kinds of disease and things like that, get to the West Coast, take a boat up to San Francisco. They probably ditched the boat in San Francisco. And what we know is when he came back a couple of years later, he had the equivalent of $6 million in gold. And so suddenly Robert became the wealthiest Harlan man. All the other Harlan relatives struggled with money throughout the He became the wealthiest. And he moved to Cincinnati, which across the river was then in the 1850s, where free black people had a real opportunity. He invested in black-owned businesses, as simple as a grocery in a building that he owned, and as complicated as a place called Dumas House that was the hostelry for free black people, where there would be well-off black people who would be playing cards in the front room, but then later when the Fugitive Slave Act came in, they would be hiding runaways in the basement. But Robert Harlan became the leading citizen of Ohio at that point, the leading black citizen of Cincinnati and the state of Ohio. Then he moved to Europe and went on this adventure where he tried to bring horse racing, American-style horse racing, to England, to the sport of kings. And while he didn't have total success in the racing, he became a very respected figure during the Civil War years in Europe, traveling through Europe. And this is all documented in racing journals and things like that from the times. So after the war, when John Harlan has fought in the war for multiple years, seen a lot of combat, led the 800-person division that he oversaw. He retired as a colonel, but there were already papers in to promote him to general. He comes out of the war, John Harlan comes out of the war, and takes his father's position as the Attorney General of Kentucky. Robert Harlan, who has been in Europe, comes back to Cincinnati, now free, and now as a free state. He had bought his freedom earlier, but now in a country where freedom was the rule, and became again the leading black citizen of Ohio. John underwent a major political change during that time. For the first year or two after the Civil War, he had been the state's leading law enforcement officer. And he himself, if you remember, the Harlan family had been pushing compromises and moderation and imploring people to support the Union, find any way to do so. So he and the Speed brothers, who were close friends of Abraham Lincoln, had literally stood on street corners in Louisville with bullhorns, imploring their neighbors to stick with the Union, stick with the United States, promising that the Lincoln administration would be generous with them if they maintained their support for the Union, which they did ultimately. They were neutral at first, and then they supported the Union. Instead, after the war, there were so many Confederate sympathizers in Kentucky, and it was a state where people were enslaved, that Kentucky was placed under martial law by the Lincoln administration, and then after that by Andrew Johnson's administration. So Harlan was in this difficult position of having to defend his state's desire for freedom against the federal government, which also put him in an awkward position when he's being pushed to support the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, which are the price of entry for most states back into the Union, but Kentucky was already in the Union, so they had to make their own decisions on this. So Harlan was in this difficult position as an elected official, and once again was stuck in the position in the middle of being sort of the compromiser, the person. He did not support immediate ratification of the 13th Amendment in Kentucky, believing that they should have a plebiscite, and I think he felt that if there was electoral support for freedom, that it would actually stick rather than having the federal government force it onto Kentucky. He also, I think, felt an obligation to those neighbors that he was imploring with that bullhorn that, the Lincoln administration had to be generous to them. But then an important thing happened. The Ku Klux Klan took root in Kentucky. And he shifted positions entirely and became what we would call a radical Republican during that period, which was a civil rights supporting Republican. He gave speeches saying he thanked God that the great sunlight of freedom now shines on every American, and called slavery the greatest despotism of all time. He made a very full-throated conversion. And that, of course, won him support around the country. So when Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876 became president after the disputed election in 1876, and one of his promises was to put a Southerner on the Supreme Court, John Harlan's name was on the list. He was a leading politician in Kentucky and known to be smart on the law. Came from this legal family. But there persisted the reputation. The Justice Committee at the time, the Senate Justice Committee, was dominated by radical Republicans. There was a sense that Harlan was a latecomer to a lot of these causes, and that he may not actually, in his heart, support civil rights, and that he may revert, flip-flop again to become a Kentucky conservative. So Robert Harlan, at the time, was the leading black politician and political leader in Ohio, which was the crucial state in presidential politics. That's why we had so many presidents in that era from Ohio. People are nodding along on that. And the black vote was actually what made Ohio Republican rather than Democrat. So black people actually had real power politically in Ohio. So Robert Harlan, during that period, traveled down to Washington, and he was actually serving as an intermediary and sending letters back to John Harlan saying, these people are going to support you, these people are not going to support you, and talking about his own efforts to try to get Harlan onto the Supreme Court. And we don't know what effect that had. These are just a few stray letters that have come back. But you can easily imagine that if the knock on Harlan was he was not really going to support civil rights, having the leading black politician in Ohio vouch for you and say, I grew up in the same house, and I know this person, and he's going to support us, I think made a big difference. And it was actually a fairly close confirmation. So he got confirmed onto the Supreme Court. For the first 5 years, Harlan was only 45 when he went on the court. For the first 5 years, he deferred to older colleagues. The Chief Justice at the time, Morrison Waite, believed in consensus. And so Harlan was kind of waiting his turn. In 1883, however, he made a huge change and became the Great Dissenter that we think of today. He became the person who objected to all those cases that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And what brought about the change? I think it was a striking moment of conscience. These civil rights cases in 1883 were an amalgam of cases of people all around the country who had been denied, black people who had been denied basic services. There was a theater goer in New York who had been denied tickets to an opera. There was a man on the frontier in Kentucky who was denied a seat in a restaurant. There was a state legislator in Missouri who was denied a room at the one hotel in Jefferson City when he came to exercise his duties. There was a woman, a wealthy woman, mixed race, who was thrown out of a first-class railroad car. They brought all these cases together, North and South. These cases brought together in the civil rights case, and this was sort of an epic moment in 1883. And unlike in Plessy v. Ferguson, which we now think of as more of a familiar name, at the time, the civil rights case of 1883 was the nation's great requiem on race. It was the front page news everywhere, and it was talked about in every corner of the country. They were even interrupting theater productions in Georgia to give updates on the progress of this case. And once again, the Supreme Court really wanted to have a unanimous opinion. And Justice Joseph Bradley, who was actually a rather smart justice and somewhat well remembered for his legal acumen, he came up with a theory that he said, traditionally, the U.S. Constitution is a restraint on the government. Therefore, we have these post-Civil War amendments that we're looking at basically for the first time, but with a few other cases in between to do it, that have extended those rights against states, but it should still be just a restraint on state actions. So, if a ticket taker at the opera refuses to serve a black person, or an innkeeper refuses to serve a black person, that's not the state of Missouri doing that. That is a hotelier doing it. So that should be a local matter. So there should be no constitutional grounds for the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Now, John Harlan knew that in the constitutional discussions about those post-Civil War amendments, the whole discussion of the 14th Amendment was they needed to provide a constitutional basis for a Civil Rights Act that had existed, a prior statute that had existed. He also knew that it was very much intended that these amendments were meant to bring black people up to a level of equality with white people. In fact, equal protection was written into those amendments. So he really was tortured over this decision, and it was a terrible time in his personal life because his eldest daughter, he had 6 children, his eldest daughter was really the light of his life and the light of their family life, had just died after delivering a baby, and it had shocked the family. And John Harlan wrote to his 3 sons who were in college that every day of his life he was going to draw inspiration from their sister's story, and that she was the noblest individual who had ever lived. And what had she done? She had taught, as a volunteer, the children of free men and women, taught them to read. So I think he's got all of these things pulling at him. His daughter Edith's commitment, his knowledge of Robert Harlan, who had actually helped him get on the Supreme Court. And he had seen with Robert Harlan, when people's rights were protected, black people's rights were protected, they went straight to the top. Robert Harlan was a wealthy, powerful man, and there was no reason to doubt his abilities as long as his rights were protected. And he also thought back to the Dred Scott decision, how when the Supreme Court gets something wrong, it gets it right. In fact, there's a story of his wife, Malvina, who was very close to him and who shared his strong convictions in many, many ways. They had a very close marriage. And she said that he was sitting in this study of this house in Massachusetts Avenue that they had, which they would later leave because they felt it was haunted by their daughter. They just couldn't be there because they were remembering her too much in there. But he's sitting in this study trying to think about this case. And she said that she took an inkwell that had been a Supreme Court keepsake that Chief Justice Roger Taney had used when he wrote the Dred Scott decision. And she just quietly put it on his desk to sort of remind him of the stakes. She knew how much he hated the Dred Scott decision. And she then celebrated that the same ink that wrote the Dred Scott decision wrote Harlan's famous dissent in the civil rights cases of 1883. And it shocked his colleagues that he went against them. He was the one dissenter. And he wrote a very powerful opinion, an opinion that I think set the tone for his future dissents. It had a sense of sort of moral approbation in it that a lot of his dissent had. He said, Justice Bradley had that sort of logical, it only applies to state action, so the Constitution can't justify a Civil Rights Act. But then Justice Bradley went a little further in the dicta and said, there must come a time in the evolution of any race that it ceases to be the special favorite of the law and takes the rank of mere citizen. And Harlan went straight at that. He said, it's scarcely fair to say that black people are special favorites of the law. This was at a time when the Ku Klux Klan was lynching hundreds of people in the South every year. And, so Harlan had that sense of moral outrage, that sense that real people are going to suffer because of this decision. But he also, I think when you look back on it, as a matter of interpreting those post-Civil War amendments for the first time, he was actually a brilliant work of legal scholarship. He talks about ways in which both the 13th and 14th Amendment can allow for legislation to enforce equal rights, and that civil rights laws should fall under that category. He also talked about how the Commerce Clause allows the government to regulate business, and if the government has the power to, for example, loan money to railroad companies to build railroads, that it also should have the power to order those companies to accept black passage or something. So, for example, again, 100 years later, that was the exact grounds on which a successor Civil Rights Act was achieved. Harlan went on to be, in many, many different cases, the greatest friend to black people on the court. When decisions came down, like the civil rights cases of 1883, there was total despair in the black community. We know this because black newspapers are now digitized. Frederick Douglass called it the darkest moment in history. It was the real unraveling of the Civil War, lessons of the Civil War. But when Harlan's Dissent came out, Douglass, among others, started promoting it, called it the greatest opinion that was written in the history of the United States, said she spread like falling leaves throughout the entire country. So Harlan went on to dissent in case after case where the Supreme Court withdrew support for black rights. That culminated in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. By that time, he'd been around this track a lot of times, right? And this was actually a lesser-known case. People didn't really understand the stakes in the separate carve-out, the separate but equal case in New Orleans. It wasn't even front-page news in New Orleans, by the way, because everybody just assumed the Supreme Court was going to allow segregation to hold. But Harlan wrote his solo dissent that has become really one of the most important documents in American history. And the lines in it are some of the kinds of lines that, get etched on buildings. They talk about very fundamental principles of America. And those of you who are lawyers here, I think many of you are, understand that, legal cases, even great legal cases, can actually be kind of, boring and routine in a lot of ways. But it's very rare to see somebody go kind of beyond the statutes and the provisions of the Constitution to look at sort of the fundamental values of the United States. And what he said in this dissent was essentially that allowing segregation violated the basic conception of equal rights that underlay everything that makes Americans Americans. And those lines that get etched on buildings were, the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. We have no caste here. And now Harlan has remembered all those lines pop up over and over again in American life and are being celebrated and recognized by people who are Supreme Court scholars and in many current day Supreme Court justices. So when assessing John Harlan's legacy, you have to ask, what if he had never done this? What if he had never existed? What if every white jurist had conspired to take away black rights? I mean, what message would that have sent to the black community if that had been the case? We know also, because of the same black newspapers that are now digitized, that when Harlan died in 1911, there were spontaneous services throughout the United States in cities that he had never traveled to. Black churches had memorial services for him. Editorials in every black newspaper, letters, people saying, who will ever stand up for our race now that Harlan is gone? May God welcome him with great friendship and affection. We know also that right after he died, a couple weeks after he died, Metropolitan AME Church, which still exists in Washington, had a joint memorial service at which Harlan's dissents were read. They were all black. No white people ever came to those things. No member of the Harlan family came. No politicians came. But 1,000 black people came to Metropolitan AME Church, and they read aloud from his dissent in the civil rights cases of 1883, and Plessy, and in some of these other cases. Thurgood Marshall was born 3 years later, so he didn't have the benefit of reading that, but was deeply inspired by those dissents when he read them. And there's stories about how in the darkest moments of fighting segregation in the 1950s, 1940s, how Thurgood Marshall would put his lawyer in the brown table, stand up and start reading from Harlan's works and analysis. And Harlan has been mentioned in the day out of Brown versus Board of Education. His dissents were mentioned in all of the legal defense fund briefs to tax segregation. But when it was finally defeated in Brown versus Board of Education, the headline of the New York Times editorial the next day was Justice Harlan concurring, and said that it was the rarest case of that voice in the wilderness that was later proven. So those are some of the reasons why I think John Harlan is special. This is why I think this story illustrates both the centrality of the Supreme Court and the very rare and important quality of courage among Supreme Court justices, which may be something that is going to be called for in the next few years. So thank you very much.
I'm Adam Willis. I was Peter's research assistant for 3 years on the Great Dissenter. I just want to say briefly before going in, thanks so much to Bookstock for having me as well. It is really special for me to be able to be here. It's been years since the Great Dissenter came out, and to be able to continue to be a part of these conversations is really cool. I want to turn the conversation a little bit from the Great Dissenter to Peter's next project, biography of Justice Samuel Alito. Peter, the story of John Marshall Harlan, as we've discussed many times, is an inspiring story. I think it's an uplifting story for many people when they think about the American Constitution. Why should people care about Samuel Alito?
I think because it's the story of our time. I mean, it really is. Like, we talked about there being lawyers here. I mean, for the last 40 years, the rise of the conservative legal movement as a concerted movement is really the story of our times, right? And Justice Alito, in my mind, is kind of the perfect representation of that movement, because there were older conservative jurists like Scalia and Bork, but they tended to be sort of academic-style gadflies. They were very theoretical in their views. They were sort of accustomed to sort of sparring in, faculty room kinds of conversations, and then in the case of Scalia, going to the opera with his Justice Ginsburg, his sort of sparring partner and stuff like that. And there were people like Clarence Thomas as well, who's very much his own story. It's a very interesting one about race in America and how Clarence Thomas ended up where Clarence Thomas ended up. But I think that Justice Alito was somebody who came of age at the dawn of the conservative legal movement, and whose career was propelled by leaders of the conservative legal movement, and also whose life story, we've just looked at the life story of John Marshall Harlan. The life story of Alito, I think, really explains why we're here. And so for everybody who's kind of wondering, how is the conservative legal movement, how did it come to dominate American law? The answers are just as interesting when you look into Alito's past as they were when you looked into Harlan's past.
Talk a little bit more about that. I mean, you just gave this whole sort of explanation of why John Marshall Harlan's biography informed his dissents in the court. What is it that you see in Samuel Alito's biography that informs his jurisprudence?
Well, so much of the conservative legal movement grew out of reactions against changes in society. And Sam Alito graduated from high school in Mercerville, New Jersey. He was from a very middle-class family. His father was an immigrant. His mother was born just 1 year after her parents immigrated from Italy. They moved to an Italian-American community where the Italian-Americans of that community faced a lot of discrimination and a lot of difficult times being associated. There were these news stories about the Italian enclaves and the places where Italian workers lived as being unclean and unsafe for decent people to come. We're talking in the 1920s and 30s. That was the world that his parents came into. And those are the lessons that he was taught when he was growing up. But they were also complemented by the sort of great post-war economic boom. You know, his parents pulled themselves up from their immigrant status. Mother was a teacher. Father started as a teacher and then became a state researcher for the state legislature of New Jersey. And they, you know, felt great pride in being able to move out of Trenton into Mercerville, which was a suburb, an immediate suburb. And they lived very modestly, but very proudly with their 2 children, and emphasized education and emphasized civic engagement. And there are these wonderful pictures of Alito at 6 years old telling stories at what was called then an old age home. You know, they had gone to a home where there were pensioners there, and Mrs. Alito, the teacher, had her little 6-year-old in his jacket and tie telling stories to the elderly people and sort of charming them. So they were very civically engaged, and they really cared about it. And they also walked to their Catholic church, and they're extremely devout Catholics. Now, the conservative legal movement, probably it's well been noted that a disproportionate number of the early leaders of the conservative legal movement were people who were from a Catholic immigrant background, like Alito's. People who were genuinely shocked and horrified by some of the social changes of the 60s. Sam Alito, when he was 1968, he was a senior in high school and the valedictorian in his high school when the post-Martin Luther King riots occurred in Trenton, and a large swath of Trenton, including where his father worked, were basically destroyed by riots. It was one of the worst riots in the country. Then he matriculated as in the last all-male class at Princeton. And when he was a sophomore, women started coming in, including some transfers into his class. But it was a tremendous culture shock for everybody at Princeton. And it's been kind of interesting to go back and talk to people from the Princeton class of 72. And, you know, they were quite shocked. A lot of the men at the class had only related to women as in dating relationships, had no sense of women as being academic peers at all. There was a lot of resistance. Issues that suddenly popped up were like about birth control and co-educated dorms. There were still parietals at that time, so when a woman went into a male dorm, would she be allowed to stay, and all this kind of stuff. And so it pushed all these social issues onto the campus. It was also a high point of Vietnam War protests, and Alito was in ROTC and was very much the subject of the wrath of anti-war protesters. At a crucial moment, they had, at Princeton, they had a student strike that forced the postponement of exams. And everybody remembers that Alito, who was such a diligent student, people remembered him as being very sort of nerdy and conservative, but an excellent student. He was furious that this had happened because, you know, he was ready to take exams. You know, it's like, what do you mean? And I think that if you want to look sympathetically to people in that situation, if you are, you know, the perfect flower of your immigrant parents who have worked since the time you were a small child, you're the valedictorian of your public high school, you've made it to this rather elitist University of Princeton, you've done all the studying. You know, this is your opportunity to succeed. You're going to be number one in this. You're going to prove yourself to all these other people. And then what do? They start protesting the war, and exams are canceled, and you can't even show your stuff. I think that was a big, important moment. He himself has said that when he was at Princeton, the wealthier students were angry at their parents. They thought their parents had the wrong values, and so they protested. He loved his parents and respected their values and agreed with their values, so he had no tension in his life. I think, you know, again, people look at these things through many different eyes, and there certainly needs to be, in my Alito book, there needs to be a counterbalance, right? You know, people who said, no, we protested the Vietnam War because people were dying in Vietnam, not because we were angry at our parents, or, you know, people while he was growing up and having a somewhat idyllic experience in the suburbs and really believing in the American dream and the American experience. There were black people in Trenton who were saying, we've talked to one person in particular who said that, you know, the neighborhood of Chambersburg, which is the Italian-American neighborhood that Alito was always identified with, black people couldn't walk in Chambers. You know, it's like in Chambers, you couldn't go there. So there were different realities that were colliding and that still are colliding in our society. But if you want to say, how did people in the early 1970s until the early 1980s, which is sort of the formative movement of the conservative legal movement, how did they come to decide to rebel so strongly against the legal system of the time, which they saw as being very much influenced by liberal judges. Those are the kinds of experiences that really resonated with them.
This is a very different project from the one you and I worked on years ago, where we were poring over archives and old newspaper clips. I'm interested to hear more about what it's like reporting out the life of someone who is still alive and is still an extremely important player in American politics. What have you learned from talking to close associates, friends, those who know Samuel Alito well, and specifically, how has he changed over the years?
There's sort of three questions in one there. The first of the difference between the two books is that it's actually it's just different. When you're doing a work of history, you have to sort of find documentary evidence and then piece it together. And the tension in writing it is you don't want to extrapolate too much or assume too much from small pieces of information. On the other hand, you don't want to sort of cheat the story and just deliver sort of undifferentiated facts. In writing about a live person, the pressure is almost on the opposite side because you get so much more information. There's so many more people to talk to. There's so many more perspectives that are coming in that you almost have to be conservative about telling the story and aware that some of these people have different memories and some of them have different agendas and some of them are, it's one of those Rashomon-like situations where people will look at the strike at Princeton and each person will see something different in it. So there's some questions there. In terms of the overall trajectory of Alito's life and career and of the conservative legal movement, I think it's important to sort of, in any book, to sort of posit a question at the beginning of the book and answer it or try to answer it by the end of the book. So we talked about, in the Harlan book, it was like, what were the roots of wisdom? What made him right when the others were wrong? And we tried to answer that by the end. In the Alito book, it's like, how did somebody who we really considered the exemplar of immigrant life or second generation immigrant life and success in a state like New Jersey, and who was known as somebody who was polite, who was intelligent, who was a deep believer in the American system, who was deferential to others. How did he reach a position where so many people now, and I'm not prejudging where he is, but there are a lot of people now who would say, he is a partisan, he is a person of strong convictions. I'm not buying into that directly. This is just a question that needs to be asked, but how did that perceptive difference occur? And a related question with the whole conservative legal movement is that the conservative legal movement started as a defense of precedent. What happened in the 1970s and early 1980s is that the left was very ascendant. We hear about unenumerated rights and using the Constitution to institutionalize social change. But the left wanted much more than that. There was a movement, very persistent movement, for example, for a constitutional right to a basic income. And a lot of people believed in it and were talking about it. And that was, when Alito was growing up, that was what he was hearing when people talked about the Constitution. It also was a time you've heard about the critical legal studies movement, which is also vertically critical race theory, which said, why are we paying so much attention to these precedents that were established when women were repressed? They were all older white men on the court, and black people were held in segregation, and immigrants were given second-class citizens. So why do we revere these precedents in the law? So the left, people like Duncan Kennedy, who I've spoken to in his book, and it was the leader of the critical legal studies movement, were saying, yes, we need a more dynamic legal system. We need one that looks at the Constitution in a totally fresh way and says, these precedents need to be thrown out or, need to be viewed as acts of prejudice and not as legal precedent. For conservatives like Samuel Alito, especially believers in the American legal system, that was a horrific idea. That was, they would say, conservatives of that era would say, the legal system is one of the great accomplishments of American life. It's something that has developed over 200 years, that has reached a status where people really trust and believe in it. And here are these liberals who are saying we should just throw out the precedent and throw out the black letter law and go with our gut in terms of social change. That would be the conservative critique of these positions. So that's where the conservative legal movement got its start. You've all heard about, judges that interpret the law, don't make the law, and judicial restraint, things like that. Now, arguably, in the last 10 years, with a 6-3 majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court, they've overturned a lot of precedents, and in ways that fundamentally change American life. If we stop right now, abortion rights have been overturned. Restrictions on campaign finance have been given a total constitutional bar. In the Hobby Lobby decision, religious employers can deny contraception or any form of benefit to workers as long as the workers had some other means of getting it. There are numerous other cases that have really shaped our lives in a conservative direction, but these are cases where conservative justices have been overturning precedents or asserting new rights. For example, the free exercise of religion. The traditional view was that you can have your religious beliefs, but when your religious beliefs turn to action, you have to follow civil law. That idea has been persistently undermined by the conservative court, which is finding justifications, for example, in the cake baking case with gay marriage, to say that a person who has religious beliefs and wants to exercise them in a way that is allegedly discriminatory should be granted the right to do that because they have a constitutional right to exercise their religion. These are fundamental changes. So the question in the book is, how did we get from we're defending the American legal system as a black letter bulwark to we're going to have to overturn all these precedents because we think that the law should be different,
Sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, I want to bring in a quote from the Great Dissenter. You talk early in the book about just the importance of dissent. Peter was just talking about John Marshall Harlan's dissent in the 1883 civil rights cases, which Frederick Douglass spoke highly of at the time and really preached the importance of. There's a quote from Frederick Douglass that I think really explains the importance of dissent in my own thinking. He said at the time, in the early days of the anti-slavery conflict, when anti-slavery men were few and were often ridiculed for their numerical insignificance, I was wont to console myself with what seemed to many a transcendental idea, that one man with God is majority, that if such a man does not represent what is, he does represent what ought to be or what ultimately will be. That was the importance of dissent in the Harlan era. What is the role of dissent in today's court, and has it changed since then?
First of all, it's a really good quote, and it's a quote in a letter that Frederick Douglass sent to John Marshall Harlan too. So this is not something that is in the great quote book of Frederick Douglass anywhere. Look, it's a very practical matter. I do believe that Harlan's dissents were heard, but they were heard in very many different ways, and there are many different ways that dissent can become a majority opinion. And this is important to sort of keep in mind as we think about some of these recent precedents that liberal justices want to see overturned and have written dissents in. For example, in the Sherman Antitrust Act cases, within Harlan's lifetime, essentially he and others were able to persuade his colleagues to change their position. So the Supreme Court initially declared it unconstitutional in a case in which Harlan was the only dissenter, but then cleared the way for antitrust prosecutions 10 to 20 years later, while Harlan was still in the court. The court just changed its mind. So it's possible to do that, to go from a sole dissent to a very different place. In the case of the income tax cases, Harlan's dissent was read on the well of the House to pass a constitutional amendment to allow the income tax to return, which eventually happened in 1913. And so a dissent can be a rallying cry. That's sort of another. And then, we had the example that I mentioned earlier of the Plessy v. Ferguson lines about the universality of equality and the colorblind Constitution and how that gets pushed forward by people like Thurgood Marshall. So they can also sort of inspire legal activists to find a new generation of justices to reconsider some of these precedents. So I don't think that dissents are by any means a dead letter, which some people do. And I also urge you, if you're thinking about dissents and the importance of dissents today, to look at Justice Sotomayor's dissent in the case of presidential immunity. Chief Justice Roberts, who's a well-respected, very well-respected jurist, wrote an opinion that had a sense, I think, of the tortured arguments the Supreme Court had in looking at what level of presidential immunity should exist. And it was, in my opinion alone, not Chief Justice Roberts' strongest work. You know, when his career is over, he's probably not going to point to that opinion as when it felt like he was trying to do too much in it. But Sotomayor's opinion absolutely was a powerhouse. I mean, if you're looking at one dissent that's going to be kind of remembered long, she really outdid herself.
I want to leave some time for audience questions, but just one more question. You've talked about Samuel Alito's alignment with the conservative law movement. The Federalist Society is an instrumental part of that movement. We haven't totally covered the recent Trump cases, but where do you see the conservative law movement going under Trump and the years after?
Well, it's sort of the great current question. And again, I know all of you in Vermont are very, very concerned about the Morin case and people being deported for the alien enemies, whatever Public Enemies Act, what is the 1798 statute. There ultimately will be a reckoning probably before the Supreme Court that will look at the question of whether the kind of foreign policy emergency that Trump is citing in terms of anti-Semitism as an American foreign policy priority is really what Congress had in mind back in 1798 when it gave the president this power. In the meantime, there's so many legal battles on so many different fronts that you can look at the injunctions that have been leveled and the way the justices have aligned. And Alito and Clarence Thomas definitely are giving Trump a lot of space. And I think if you were to judge at this moment, there would be those people that I referred to before. We said that Alito is a partisan, and those people would step forward and say, well, here's the proof of it. Alito has essentially sided with Trump in almost everything so far. I would say that's not necessarily going to hold. These are largely procedural cases, and clearly Alito does believe that the president should be given a wide swath of discretion. Again, critics would immediately point out that when there were injunctions leveled against, the distribution of abortion bills, you never heard Alito saying courts were overstepping the bounds on that. And when there were injunctions against Joe Biden's efforts to forgive student loans, nobody on the conservative side was objecting to that. But nonetheless, these are sort of part of the delicate politics of injunctions. And when the merits are heard, Alito might end up being in a different place. And I say that only because the history of the Supreme Court is that justices do tend to surprise people. And also, the Federalist Society, which we haven't had a chance to talk about for now, which has created a 90,000 lawyer army, essentially, that who don't always agree with each other, by the way. There are some people who are just part of the scholarly exchange there, so I don't want to suggest, this is not a conspiracy theory or anything, but there is an ecosystem of conservative law that is out there and that's powerful. But it is not equivalent, in my mind, to being pro-Trump. I mean, it is, if anything, the conservative legal movement is so powerful and dominant right now that it's bigger than Trump in some ways. And I would be surprised, genuinely surprised, if even the Trump appointees and other conservatives just fell into line and allowed Trump to, for example, impound funds and refuse to fund entire agencies like USAID, and to sort of stretch the concept of wartime to such an extent that a Venezuelan gang is wartime combat, to try and utilize the president's powers to suspend habeas corpus, which Stephen Miller, I guess, suggested. I wonder whether the conservative legal movement is going to stand for that. And once the once the wall crumbles and a lot of those conservative jurists who are very educated, proud people who really believe in the rightness of their cause and their views and their view of the Constitution, once they one time go against Trump, they might do so again. So I look at the conservative legal movement as something very different than MAGA. And there may well be a time in the next 5 or 10 years when people will be saying, thank goodness we had the Federalist Society to be a curb in Trump. I really think that's possible. So, so I was telling Adam, it's all speculative because I haven't written this Alito book yet, and I really want the Alito book also to be the story of the conservative legal movement and use him as the narrative life. This is not going to be, when he was 37 years old, he took a memorable trip to Portugal, and this is going to be meant to go at the big issues of our time and to address them in an informative way. But we're probably going to end in a place where we're talking about, the big test is just on the horizon, just over the horizon. Is the conservative legal movement going to stand up to Trump's efforts to expand the power of the presidency or not?
I can keep asking questions if there aren't audience questions, but I'm going to throw it to you guys. Does anyone want to jump in first with a question?
I have a question. Well, what happens if, this is everybody's big fear, what if Supreme Court rules and Trump says, yeah, you know what, army? And he just ignores the Supreme Court, kind of like with the returning of, Great Dissenter.
That's an interesting question, Adam. I also talked about that a little bit earlier, too. I was telling you that I think the Supreme Court is worried that if they are too granular in their orders and too specific in their orders and things, that it runs the risk of the president defying them and then trying to create what, we all talk about, the constitutional crisis that's coming. So I think that these being very thoughtful jurists are probably going to give some thought to what's going to preserve the rule of law in the longer stretch, and try to come up with a decision that would be very, very difficult for Trump or any president to actively violate in that way. I was mentioning the Harlan case is the example of voting rights when the whole Supreme Court said, well, what Alabama was doing violates the 15th Amendment, clearly, but we had no enforcement power, so it's a political question, we're going to toss it forward. It's easy in hindsight to say that those justices were just lesser men than Harlan. They were ciphers. He was a great man. They were ciphers. They were willing to go along and get along. But I think they were genuinely worried about a civil war. They felt like if we declare under our order that the state of Alabama needs to completely change its constitution and its voting rights pattern, and Alabama says, hell no, what happens? Do you go to arms again? Do you try to send people, now people can spin out whatever theories they want. I think that what would have happened is Alabama would have defied the Supreme Court, but there would have been pockets of Alabama that would not, and places where black people would say, wait, the federal law is that we should be registered, and there will be local officials that would probably have gone along with that. It would have been messy, but the court at least would have put down a significant marker, and the disobeying would eventually peter out to some extent. But I guess that's the long way. The proper analogy is that I think it's appropriate for the Supreme Court to worry about something like that and how, in an inflammatory moment, they move or react. But one of the considerations would be to try to craft a position and an opinion that's very hard for the president to define.
Do we have time for one or two more? Please.
I was just reflecting on your comparison example of Roberts and Alito. I was struck. I understand that when Alito was confronted with the fact that there was an upside down flag, for example, on his lawn, that one might be defensive. But I was struck by how defensive he was and how inflexible his thinking was, and in terms of his this kind of narrow view of that, and kind of not thinking about the bigger issues, and consoling people who, I think, not understanding how people might just mark him as a complete partisan, and not being concerned about that, and finding some words, some language to reassure and explain this large portion of the population. And so I'm asking, the question really is, how do you think that that specific response reflects on his capacity as a juror, as an intellectual?
I think that's an excellent question, and I can tell you what some of the reporting so far has shown, which is not entirely complete. I think there's a little bit of credibility to the idea that his wife flew the flags. There's a consistent pattern when you talk to people that she is, somebody described them as the couple where one member of the family does, one member of the couple does 95% of the talking, and it's Martha Ann Alito. And Martha Ann Alito is a strong-willed woman. So I think there's probably some credibility that she was in a dispute with neighbors, and she flew these flags as a way of defying them. And, one friend of the Alitos was sort of saying in a sort of chuckling kind of way, like, I know, well, Sam's not going to be able to control her. I don't know whether they mean it in sort of a old-fashioned, the old ball and game kind of thing, or whether they meant it literally like she's a very willful person. But there's some personal interaction that led to the flag controversy, because even if Alito was as unmindful of public opinion as you were suggesting, and even in his own response, he did not say it's appropriate to fly the flag. He said it was my wife who flew the flag. I think that Alito's style of writing and his style as a judge and justice also contribute a little bit to that perception. One of his clerks has said, in writing, he would eliminate all dependent clauses, and you can see this in his opinions. He's very cut and dry. Yes. He also believes, and this can be an admirable thing, like Harlan believed, that judging isn't just a theoretical exercise. And so while Alito's associated with some of these movements like originalism and all that, he also has acknowledged that he's not a scholar, he's not a professor. He believes himself to be a judge, and that a judge has to come up with a workable result. So some of that cut and dry nature is his unwillingness to have a lot of conditions and clauses and caveats in his prose. So it comes off as being extremely take it or leave it, I think, in his writing. Now, whether that is reflected in his personality is an interesting question, because there are people who say he's a polite man, he's a gracious man, he'll send thank you notes to people. He sent a note to me that was very gracious when I asked to interview him and refused. But he could be seen as a sort of quiet, polite person. But then there's the incident where Obama was talking about the Citizens United case during the State of the Union, and Alito blurts out, "That's not true," from the audience. And there are many speeches he's given to the Federalist Society that people consider intemperate, or not suggesting a judicial temperament. So it's just one of the big questions with him is how did this happen? Is he how did he become sort of more edgy in his later years? And one explanation is the confirmation process. I think we've seen judicial confirmation process become so brutal that people become more partisan and more opinionated because of the process. And I've known people who've gone through the lower court judges who've gone through this process. And imagine, you're a man or a woman of the law who is a middle-aged person who gets nominated for something. And you suddenly realize that half of the people in Congress are looking for anything to discredit you. They're looking at your grade school report cards. They're talking to your first partner, your worst enemy from high school is being interviewed by them. And you develop this sort of heightened sense that these people are out to get, they're not only out to get, they're going to destroy my reputation. Like everything that I'm going to be humiliated in front of my family, in front of my colleagues. It's like, this is brutal, right? And then there's this other group that is raising money and running ads to support you and all, and you're like, okay, well, these people are going way, way, way out of their way to get me on the court and to defend me, and, you know, are defending me at various events and saying, you know, when they say, you know, he's a bigoted man, yeah, I see a great American, you know, and so you get onto the court, and you feel like, you know, you're there because of the generosity of one group of people and defeating the evil intentions of another group of people, and it makes these justices feel like they're there for a purpose that has something not quite to do with, you know, viewing cases in a totally unbiased way.
You were saying that in a lot of ways, Alito's own thinking on the law and on his role in the court sort of changed in some ways as a result of that confirmation process, which is interesting. Maybe one more, and then we'll cut it.
Yeah, I was struck by the conversation earlier about Judge Harlan and his life experiences that influenced his opinions, especially that initially, when he was on the court, he refrained from, you know, really writing opinions and presenting, and then the light bulb. With his experience with Robert Harlan, his daughter in childbirth, it makes me think about our current judicial system, where, you know, we don't have the judges riding circuits anymore. Part of that early on was to get them out in the community, and now we have justices who may not be experiencing those opportunities to speak with people. Like I came into town and I saw dissenters on the corner, you know, like dissenters in a different way, but expressing their opinions in the way that they can. And I feel like, you know, our current justices are not engaging in conversations with real people who would have different opinions and it's life experience. How do you think Alito's personal sort of elevation to the court and her life experience is he still stretching his brain, I guess, is what I want to.
I think that's an excellent point, and about Alito specifically, there are people who say that, you know, he is not. He spent 14 years on the circuit court. He's been 18 or 19 years on the Supreme Court. That's, you know, 30 plus years of being in a fairly cloistered environment. And they also pointed out that he's one of the justices who chooses clerks for ideological comfort. It used to be on the Supreme Court that there were a large number of justices that would only choose clerks who applied to all of the justices because they would feel like they're getting somebody who's like a pure legal talent. Now, justices do sometimes hire clerks because they think they have the same views as they do. So it becomes an ecosystem, and the clerks reinforce the justices, and the former clerks remain very close. So they'll have like reunions every year and things like that. And so everybody is reinforcing everybody's views. So that you're right that it's a big problem on the Supreme Court. Another problem is we no longer let politicians go on the Supreme Court because of largely the abortion issue. Anybody who served in public office or was elected to anything and applied to be dog catcher had some questionnaire where they offered a view on abortion rights, and that was so toxic that people couldn't be confirmed. So when Sandra Day O'Connor retired and later died, she was the last justice who had political experience. Harlan was in politics. Harlan was an elected attorney general in Kentucky. He also ran for governor twice in Kentucky, and was once was up for Congress too. He was a major political figure in Kentucky. I think his greater love was probably the law, but it kept him on top of the issues in a way that today's justices absolutely are not. So I think that's it.
Peter's gonna stick around to sign some books, I think. But
Absolutely.